How do you feel about cilantro? For those of you who speak English dialects outside of the United States and some parts of Canada, how do you feel about coriander leaves specifically? Love them or hate them. On today's episode of Life's Potluck Buffet, I'm going to try to get to the bottom of why we call in the United States the leaves of the coriander plant cilantro and the fruits of the plant, which we call seeds. Well, they're called seeds around the world in English. Why we call the coriander plants seeds coriander. And also, if you've ever seen a thing called culantro, spelled like cilantro but with a U, what that's all about, and is that different? Spoiler, it is. But I'll let you know how on today's episode of Life's Potluck Buffet. I'm John Paulus. Thanks for joining me. If you've been enjoying Life's Potluck Buffet, please subscribe. If you've already subscribed, thank you so much. I truly appreciate it. If you have a Brave browser, you can now contribute basic attention tokens to Life's Potluck Buffet with John Paulus on YouTube. Thank you for your support, and thank you for listening. All right, we got to sort out the beginnings of all of this. Let's roll it back maybe 4,000 years or more to when a language was being spoken in the eastern part of the Mediterranean and in places that are also today part of the nation of Greece, and in places that are now a part of the nation of Turkey in the western part of Asia. That language was the language that came before the migrations of people speaking a language that would become, well, eventually Greek. And so that what is called pre-Greek language, as we've talked about in other episodes, is the root of many, many words in ancient Greek, many, many words in modern English, for that matter. And one of those words is coriander. Coriander is its native habitat is in places where, well, this pre-Greek language was spoken, and also all the way across southern Europe. Scientists can't be sure exactly if there's a specific location where the first wild coriander was, but generally they say somewhere in the northern Mediterranean basin. Wherever the people came from who were speaking the language that would grammatically become the basis for the Greek language, wherever they came from, they don't seem to have had coriander, because they certainly didn't have a word for it. And usually when you don't have a word for something, you don't know what it is. So that is interesting in itself. The fact that coriander has been in the Mediterranean basin since time immemorial, and it's still there today. You could find places where it grows wild all around the southern Mediterranean for sure. Now, and also it's cultivated in places in Asia and Africa, around the Mediterranean as well, and also around the world now. In fact, it's really interesting because ancient cooking in the Mediterranean featured coriander quite prominently. Modern cooking, influenced as it is by various cooking techniques and dishes coming from places where there wasn't coriander, it's not as big of a thing. And that's really interesting, because in places where coriander did not exist in ancient times, it is an enormously important thing. So the role of coriander has switched. No, so for example, in Mexico and in countries in Southeast Asia, where cilantro, coriander, that plays a major role in cuisine. I always find that kind of fascinating to think that, the foods of the ancient Mediterranean basin would have, with their broad use of things like fish sauce and coriander and cumin, would have more in common with foods of Southeast Asia than they do with foods that are currently in the Mediterranean basin, influenced as the modern foods are by cooking that comes from places where and time periods when things like coriander, cumin, fish sauce, so forth, weren't part of the cuisine. Oh, and a quick note about the ancient words for coriander. You'll sometimes see this idea that they somehow come from the word for a type of bug, a bed bug, as we call them in U.S. English. That's one of those folk etymologies that just doesn't really reflect the reality of the situation. That word that is the beginning of the word for coriander in ancient languages, that sounds like a ancient Greek word for bed bug, is actually that bed bug word. The folks who came, who were speaking the language that would become Greek, came into the places that are now in modern Greece and Turkey and so forth in the Eastern Mediterranean. Those people knew about bed bugs, and they had names for bed bugs, because by that time in history, most of the world knew about bed bugs pretty well. So they had a name for that, and it actually seems to be related to the Russian word for a moth. So that's kind of interesting as well. But the point is that they knew plenty. They didn't. This wasn't something that they had to borrow a word for. Okay, now let me sort out the situation here in the United States. In the U.S., we have a kind of weird situation. We call the leaf of the coriander plant cilantro, and we call the fruit of it a coriander seed. And all around the world, you see the use of the word coriander seed for the fruit. I don't think anybody in English uses coriander fruit to describe it. However, it is in fact the whole fruit and not just the seed of the plant. But that's just splitting hairs. The point here is that around the world, you might say, oh, put the coriander leaf or put the coriander seed in this recipe. The way to distinguish between the two is just to say leaf or seed. In American English, we don't need to do that, because we use the Spanish word cilantro for the leaf, except we say it with an American accent, so we say cilantro. So that's what we use for the leaf. And for the seed, we just call it coriander, or sometimes coriander seed, but sometimes just coriander. So then there became this confusion where people say, well, I see this bottle of dried spice thing called coriander, and then I also see in a restaurant a thing with cilantro, and so they must be two different things, right? And the answer is no. It's just simply, it all comes from that old pre-Greek word for coriander, which was something like koriandron, and that word, in some later Latin and Romance language forms, started to become Kiliandra with an L instead of an R, and, well, eventually became cilantro. On the other hand, there was a whole strain of words for coriander that stayed, well, as coriander, and didn't change much, honestly, from what we think is the original, that original word from 4,000 years ago. Now, the problem is that why in English do we, in American English and no other form of English, or at least I understand that maybe some places in Canada use cilantro to call the some supermarkets in Canada, I believe, may use the word cilantro. If you are from Canada, please let me know in the comments whether you say cilantro or coriander for the leaf of the coriander plant. Now, here's the reason why the distinction happened in U.S. English. And it is a product of the Spanish-American Wars over imperial possessions in the islands of the Philippines, in Puerto Rico, and in Cuba. Why does the Spanish-American War have anything to do with this? Well, here's why. In the 19th century, there were no recipes really that used the cilantro leaf in U.S. cooking or in U.S. pharmacy work. So the oil of coriander and the coriander seed and so forth were used in drug preparations for sure. But it was always the seed and the which is the fruit of the coriander, either dried or fresh. Also, I saw one reference to a mention in Virginia of the U.S. state of Virginia of green coriander, and I don't know if they mean non-dried. They probably mean the non-dried fruit of the coriander plant. They probably don't mean the leaf. I think they probably would have said that. But so the coriander is used in those preparations, and also in the 19th century, you start to see recipes from South Asia, and specifically recipes for various curries that are being brought to the U.S. and kind of promulgated and promoted as good recipes to make. So you see that in the 19th century, and those always involve coriander, the fruit part, in the spice mixture, rather than cilantro leaves as garnish, or coriander leaves as garnish. Sorry, I'm already saying it. Coriander leaf as garnish, or cilantro as we call it. So that's what's going on there, is that there really wasn't much use for the leaf in the U.S. context in the 19th century. But along came the Spanish-American Wars, in which the Spanish imperial possessions, like the Philippines or Cuba or Puerto Rico, all of a sudden, because of Spain's loss in this war, these places, despite objections from one side of the political powers that were in the United States at the time, these places became part of the U.S. imperial project and became the first signs of the United States as a world power. Well, historians of many fields of study will tell you that the first thing that needs to happen, and the first thing that you see when you see the formation of this kind of imperial project, is you see the listing of things that are now possessed. And so, sure enough, 1903, we have from the Bureau of Insular Affairs, which was in charge of places like Puerto Rico, Cuba, Philippines, elsewhere as well. And that office published a description of the Philippines, where there was just lists and lists of stuff in the Philippines. And one of those things, which needed to be explained to what it meant in the Philippines to people in the Philippines, was cilantro. And that description of the Philippines in 1903 describes cilantro as the coriander plant, and that is what it is called in the Philippines. And the reason it's called that in the Philippines, because the various different language speakers in the Philippines borrowed it from Spanish. So that is where we see the first use of cilantro for the coriander plant. Now, if you fast forward a few years, the Department of Education of the United States created, or had commissioned, some home economics, as we would call it, cooking and so forth, textbooks for use in what was called in the United States at that time Puerto Rico, and kind of still pronounce it that way in American English. But Puerto Rico, which is Puerto Rico in Spanish, the home economics textbooks taught a traditional dish of Puerto Rico, among others, which is, of course, odd because you're teaching young people how to cook the food there. Well, that's what happens in these situations. So the recipe is for chicken with rice, arroz con pollo, as it's listed in the textbook, and the recipe includes cilantro. And this is the first evidence that we have of a English language textbook borrowing the Spanish word to use in a recipe. And it's from there that the word cilantro started getting used more commonly in all sorts of these both textbook and guidebook and all sorts of books like that. Cilantro started getting used to describe the leaf. Now, cilantro is very common in cooking in Puerto Rico, of course, but another thing that usually goes with it is a plant that is a cousin to cilantro that is actually from tropical North America, and that is culantro. And culantro is called recao in some dialects of Spanish. I believe in Puerto Rico that's what you call it, is recao. And but culantro is the word that got used for it in places where Spanish was spoken, but there was no local word for it. And so the use of it was needed a name, because culantro actually also is just a variant, we can see, of cilantro. From long ago, it was just a variant of cilantro. It comes from the same word. It comes from the coriander word, but it got used in places where there wasn't a local word for culantro, recao, so it gets used for that as well. Culantro is also used in Southeast Asian cooking, for example, in pho. I hope I got that right. The Vietnamese noodle soup that is so famous. Both cilantro and culantro are used in that. I believe the culantro there is the in the garnishes that you get when you get the soup. I think that's the culantro is there as opposed to in the cooking part. In the Puerto Rican recipes, the culantro and cilantro are usually combined with peppers and so forth. Sweet peppers sometimes, to create a salsa that is used in cooking. I think that's in American English. We'd understand it best as being a kind of salsa, but it's used when you cook things using it. So both are used in that as well sometimes. So the use of both cilantro and culantro together are also common, leading to greater confusion. The culantro, the leaves look a little bit more spear-like, and they have teeth, and so and the flavor is kind of similar. So you can see why that they can be used, and sometimes they be used interchangeably, but a lot of times just used together. All right, so I think we've got it all sorted out, and that's the story of coriander and its two names in the United States, and the story of culantro too, as a bonus. So let's ask the cards how to spice things up today with their own advice for our work and lives. So here we go. Yellow lemons, blue dumplings, magenta noodles. Cards, tell us somethings. All right, it's card 32. The back of your mind has a full-time job. Ask yourself a question to solve, then refinish a chair or run an errand or take a walk or do whatever your mind-clearing activity is. And while you're doing that activity, the back of your mind is solving the problem. Same is true with dreaming. Conscious problems are often solved by unconscious thought. So What activity do you do when you are trying to figure out something unconsciously? Maybe you cook, maybe you make some dishes, and maybe some of them involve cilantro or even culantro. So give that a try today. Do something that you do just to let your mind wander so you can solve a problem that the front of your mind is having a hard time solving. And I'll see you tomorrow on Life's Potluck Buffet.